Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. There are stories whispered in backwoods towns across America, the kind that never make it into history books, the kind that slip between the cracks of recorded memory. But if you listen closely, at a gas station on the edge of nowhere, or in a bar where the lights burn too dim, you'll hear fragments. A girl who should never have been born. A family that folded in on itself again and again, until the bloodline twisted like a rope about to snap. They called her a daughter, a niece, a sister. But the truth was far darker. She was born her own mother's sister. Imagine the kind of family tree that doesn't branch outward, but curls back into itself, trapping generation after generation in a circle of silence. This girl, unnamed in official records, lived a life both unthinkable and inevitable. Her existence was not an accident. It was the result of years of secrets, of cousins marrying cousins, of brothers crossing lines that should never be crossed. The people who knew her would later say she looked like a child from another century, too small for her age, with a face that carried contradictions, both old and young. The town where she grew up never acknowledged her fully. Neighbors whispered, but no one intervened. In that way, her story belongs not just to her family, but to the entire community that looked away, because when you see something you know is wrong, and you choose silence, you become part of the story too. And so she grew up in a house where mothers and daughters blurred into one, where the word family lost all meaning. She was both child and sibling, both innocent and a reminder of every sin committed before her birth. And the older she grew, the more her very existence unsettled those who lived around her. They saw in her a mirror of their own failures, proof of what happens when silence is chosen over truth. This isn't just the story of one girl, it is the story of a curse passed down not through superstition, but through human choices, a curse that turned blood into chains. Next section. The girl's birth was never announced. There was no celebration, no church gathering, no newspaper notice to mark her arrival. Instead, she slipped quietly into the world, hidden behind the sagging walls of a house already heavy with secrets. Her mother was young, too young, and yet she was also her aunt. The family line had doubled back on itself in ways that are difficult to trace and even harder to speak aloud. Birth certificates, when they existed at all, were falsified. Names were shifted, years adjusted, so no outsider could follow the pattern. But the truth seeped out all the same, carried in the features of the child. Neighbors noticed first. Her eyes never seemed to look the same direction. Her jaw sat uneven, as though her face had been sculpted by trembling hands. Some said she smiled too rarely, others that she smiled too often, at times when no joy could possibly be found. Children in the town learned quickly not to stare at her in public, because their parents would scold them sharply. Don't ask questions, don't look too long. But children always sense what adults try to bury. They whispered to one another that she wasn't normal, that she carried inside her something unnatural. Not evil, not exactly, but wrong in a way they couldn't describe. She was both familiar and foreign, a girl who seemed like family to everyone, because in some way, through tangled marriages and repeated unions, she was. Inside her home, life was a closed loop. Her uncles were also her cousins, her grandmother was also her great-aunt, and the words meant to give structure, sister, father, niece, brother, collapsed under the weight of repetition. She learned early not to ask which word applied to whom. The answers were confusing, and worse, they were dangerous. Every family portrait, if you could call them that, was another knot tied tighter. The same faces reappeared generation after generation, slightly altered, but unmistakably echoing one another. A stranger might have thought the photographs showed siblings born decades apart, but those who knew the truth saw what it really was, a bloodline turned inward with nowhere left to go. And yet, despite the weight of her origins, the girl survived. She walked to school barefoot on gravel roads, carrying books that once belonged to cousins who were also brothers. She recited lessons with a voice that quivered but never broke. To the world outside, she was just another poor child from a forgotten town, but to those who dared him. As she grew older, her presence became more unsettling to the people around her. Childhood deformities that once seemed almost delicate hardened into permanent reminders of her origins. The asymmetry of her face grew sharper, her eyes slightly crossed, gave her a look of constant confusion, even when she was perfectly aware of her surroundings. Townsfolk said she seemed to be listening to something that no one else could hear. Some whispered she carried voices in her blood, echoes of generations trapped within the same circle, speaking through her whether she wanted them to or not. But the real horror was not her appearance. It was the knowledge of who she was and how she had come to be. Every adult in that town carried some piece of the secret, and each one silently agreed to protect it. Her teachers never asked questions about her home life. Doctors who noticed her abnormalities wrote them off as congenital, a sterile word that stripped away the truth. Even the local pastor who preached fire and brimstone every Sunday looked away when she sat in the back pew, head bowed beneath the weight of a story no sermon dared to name. By the time she reached her teenage years, she understood what no one had ever explained. She wasn't supposed to exist. Her very life was a kind of mistake, a continuation of choices that never should have been made. And yet, she bore the punishment. At school, the other children avoided her. Some out of cruelty, others out of fear, because they had been raised on the same warnings. Don't stare, don't speak too much, don't invite that family into your life. She walked hallways alone, her shadow the only companion she could rely on. At home, things were worse. The line between protector and predator blurred with every passing year. Men who should have been uncles or fathers or cousins, words that once promised safety, became something else entirely. In that house, doors creaked open at night, and silence was forced upon her. This was not a story of one wrong choice, but of cycles repeated, of blood turned poisonous by the refusal to end it. Still, she carried herself with a strange resilience. Maybe it was defiance, or maybe just survival instinct, but she kept breathing, kept moving forward, even as the walls of her lineage closed tighter around her. To see her walk through town was to witness a contradiction, a fragile body carrying centuries of shame, yet refusing to collapse beneath it. The deeper you look into her life, the more the lines blur between victim and symbol. She was not just one girl, she was the embodiment of a legacy that should have ended long before her birth. Every step she took was shadowed by those who came before, men and women who ignored warnings, who chose silence over truth, who locked their sins behind closed doors and prayed no one would ask questions. But the past doesn't stay buried. It seeps into the present, often through the smallest cracks. And in her, the cracks became impossible to ignore. By now, the town had grown uneasy. People avoided her family's property altogether, walking an extra mile just to steer clear of the sagging farmhouse where broken bloodlines tangled. Stories circulated in hushed voices, children who went missing for hours, only to return saying they had seen her standing at the edge of the woods, staring at them without blinking. Teenagers dared one another to walk past her house at night, swearing they heard sounds that didn't belong to animals or people, strange cries that echoed against the trees. The truth, of course, was more disturbing than any rumor. Inside those walls, the cycle was alive and well. The family tree had no branches left, only roots twisted into one another, choking out any chance of escape. Records show that new births continued, each one greeted with dread instead of joy. And though outsiders may have pitied the children, no one intervened. Poverty made it easy to ignore, and shame made it easy to dismiss. After all, it was easier to pretend the family didn't exist than to confront what was happening in plain sight. And the girl, now nearly grown, understood that she was both proof and prophecy. Proof of what had already been done, and a prophecy of what would continue if the silence remained. She began to withdraw even further, avoiding the few places where she had once been. Seen. It was said she spoke less and less, that entire days passed without a single word escaping her lips. Perhaps she believed, as many do in such cursed bloodlines, that words only made things worse, that speaking truth aloud would only tighten the circle further. In a way, she became invisible, present, but fading, like a photograph left too long in the sun. And yet, those who did see her never forgot. They carried her image in their minds, as if her very existence had branded itself into the conscience of the town. She was no longer just a girl. She was a living secret no one dared claim. There comes a moment in every story like this when the silence can no longer hold. Secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, have a way of demanding to be heard. For this girl, that moment arrived in her late teens. By then, the weight of her family's choices had carved itself into her bones. She was quiet, watchful, and older than her years, carrying scars that were not always visible to the eye. Some said she had stopped trying to belong. Others believed she had accepted her role as the keeper of her family's unspoken history. The house where she lived was falling apart. Roof shingles curled like dead leaves, windows rattled in their frames, and the foundation sagged as though the earth itself was trying to swallow it whole. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of poverty and decay. And yet, births still occurred there. Each new child was another link in the chain, another reminder that the curse was alive. Outsiders avoided the family altogether, but when they caught glimpses, thin figures moving through dim windows, children with faces too familiar, they shivered. The resemblance from one generation to the next was too strong, too close, like reflections repeating in a cracked mirror. It's here I want to pause just for a moment. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed and carried the curse forward? Or would you have broken free, knowing the cost? The girl herself faced that question every day. Could she escape? Could she find a life beyond the walls of her family's legacy? Or had the bloodline sealed her fate before she even took her first breath? There are scattered accounts, half-whispered memories from townsfolk that she dreamed of leaving, that sometimes she walked to the edge of the county road, staring out at the horizon as though trying to imagine another life, but she always turned back. Whether it was fear, loyalty, or the invisible weight of the past, no one can say. What is certain is this: she never escaped. The circle tightened, the pattern continued, and though she was young, she already looked worn, like someone carrying not just her own years, but the years of all who came before her. Her life was not lived freely. It was lived under the shadow of choices made long before she was born. In time, the girl became a ghost while she was still alive. People spoke of her in past tense even as she walked among them, because her story felt less like a life and more like a cautionary tale. She rarely appeared in town anymore. When she did, she carried herself with a stillness that unsettled even the kindest souls. Her steps were quiet, her eyes cast down, as though she were moving through a world that had already judged her guilty for sins she did not commit. The strangest thing was how much she began to resemble the women who came before her. Photographs from decades earlier, grainy images tucked in family trunks, found only when a house was abandoned, showed faces almost identical to hers. It was as if time itself had stopped inside that bloodline. The same crooked smiles, the same heavy-lidded eyes, the same frail frames that never seemed to fully grow into adulthood. The cycle was more than genetic. It was like the family had been cursed to repeat itself, each generation nothing more than a pale copy of the last. The community, of course, bore its share of blame. They knew, they always knew, but it is easier to bury truth beneath layers of gossip than to face it head-on, so they whispered about her when she wasn't there and crossed the street when she was. She became both a spectacle and a warning. Parents used her name in hushed scoldings. Behave, or you'll end up like her. In that way, her tragedy became a tool, her suffering repurposed as morality for others, even as no one lifted a hand to save her. And yet, there are accounts, fragments of memory, that speak of something more inside her. That despite the weight, despite the shame, she carried an inner fire. Some said she kept journals hidden under floorboards, writing down her thoughts in cramped, desperate script. Others swore she sang quietly at night, old hymns and forgotten folk songs that drifted through the broken windows into the dark fields beyond. Perhaps it was her way of reaching for something outside the circle. Perhaps it was the only rebellion left to her, to dream of a world she would never touch. By the time she reached adulthood, she was already fading. Neighbors noticed she moved slower, spoke less, and seemed older than she was. Whether from illness, neglect, or simply the crushing weight of her bloodline, she carried the look of someone already half gone. Her final years were not marked by any great event, no headline, no sudden reckoning. Like most lives born into silence, hers ended quietly. Some say she died in that same decaying house, her body discovered days later by a relative too numb to weep. Others believe she vanished long before, drifting into the woods one evening and never returning. In towns like hers, disappearance and death are often the same thing. What is certain is that when she was gone, the story did not end. It lingered, clinging to the air like smoke after a fire. The family line continued, though fewer in number now. Children still appeared, their faces stamped with the same unmistakable features, their lives marked by the same unbroken silence. But something about her, this girl who was born her own mother's sister, became a turning point. Her life, though tragic, became impossible to erase. The whispers grew louder after her passing. Records that had once been hidden found their way into public hands, and the story that was meant to remain locked inside a single family spilled outward, staining the reputation of an entire town. To this day, no one speaks her name aloud. Perhaps they fear the shame it resurrects, or perhaps they fear the curse itself. But among those who still remember, there is an unspoken acknowledgement that her existence was more than just an accident. She was a mirror, forcing everyone to look at what happens when silence triumphs over truth, when blood becomes a prison rather than a bond. And so, her legacy lives not in monuments or written histories, but in the haunted silence of those who know. In the shuttered windows of the house that still stands, sagging deeper into the earth. In the uneasy way older residents glance away when outsiders ask about the family, and in the chilling thought that somewhere in the forgotten corners of America, stories just like hers are still unfolding, hidden, denied, but no less real. Her life was short, her world small, but her story, once unearthed, becomes impossible to forget. She was born her own mother's sister. She lived as proof of choices no one dared confront, and she died carrying the weight of generations that refused to break free. Now the question remains, when you stumble across stories like hers, do you turn away or do you look closer?